Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay. I think now you can see me.
Can you see me?
And not yet.
Okay. That means I have to give some video permissions probably.
Great.
Okay.
Now I can see.
So I'm going to move this over here. And then I can probably figure out.
Great. Now we have your screen.
Cool. Now I'll just change. Customize presenter display. Um, Maybe I'll just do it this way. Perfect.
Thank you for accepting our invite.
Of course.
We're excited to have you with us.
That's great. I've put the video on my other screen, so it looks like I'm not looking at you, but that's because when I'm looking at my slides, I want to be looking at the actual camera.
Okay. That's fine. I think we can start in a few minutes.
Awesome. So is this an online class or people in a room and they're watching a screen in a room?
The guest lectures are online, but the lectures of the class are in person, 2 sessions per week.
Okay.
And this is the last week of the class. The next week is the last week of the class.
Cool. And then I guess it's summertime.
Yeah, it's close to summertime. After the finals and the poster session, it's
Cool.
summertime. We can start whenever you're ready, Professor.
Okay. So should I just start off?
Great. So welcome everyone, and welcome Professor White for accepting our invite. And thank you for accepting invite. We're very excited to have you with us and for your catching title for the talk. So without further ado, we can have your talk.
Great. Thanks everyone. Yeah, I tried to make the title a little bit engaging. So reinforcement learning experiments that matter, as in like it's very easy to run experiments that don't matter. And so how do we ensure that we're doing things that matter? Of course, this is something we always care about in research. My bio was shared, but I'm at the University of Alberta, the Department of Computing Science. I'm the scientific director of the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. I'm a Canada CFAR AI chair, and I've recently started a company called RL Core Technologies, which is trying to get reinforcement learning into real world systems like water treatment plants and things like that. So this title, Reinforcement Learning Experiments That Matter. I have to be on the right page. So I'm referencing a history of work here. So a while ago now, I can't remember exactly what year it was. There was this paper about machine learning that matters, and so it kind of caused a little bit of a stir at ICML, because the position then was that a lot of the work that people were doing in machine learning didn't really matter, at least empirically. And so, this was back in the days when people were trying to squeeze out percentage performance improvements in MNIST classification. And this paper, says, well, MNIST came from the US Postal Service, and going over 99% accuracy in MNIST has no value to the US Postal Service. So why are we wasting our time with this silly benchmark? Years later, Joelle Pinot's group at McGill got really concerned about reproducibility and the empirical issues in reinforcement learning. So she wrote the paper, Deep Reinforcement Learning That Matters. And so I'm trying to, nod my head to that legacy of work in this area and say, not just deep reinforcement learning, doing reinforcement learning experiments that matter is really, really important. And there's lots to talk about in that space. So as you all well know, I work in reinforcement learning, and the basic picture or idea is that you've got this agent that's interacting with the world or the environment, and it takes actions on every time step, and then on every time step, something happens in the world, partially due to the agent's action, but not completely. And then the agent gets back an observation and a reward. And I say observation here because I'm not assuming that the agent has access to the state of the environment, just some observation of it. And this is, drawn as a loop, and I think that's very accurate because in most interesting systems, this interaction continues forever and ever, and so it truly is a loop where we just generate more and more experience. But, we draw that cartoon picture and we do a lot of experiments in the setting where the agent is really, really big. Like when you think of Atari and you think of the Rainbow agent, which is based on DQN, that has millions of parameters, and the Atari emulator is tiny. We're talking about We're talking about very, very small hardware that was built in the 80s, and we're using agents that are ridiculously large compared to the size of that environment. And so, but in reality, it's like this. In reality, you have an agent. It might be big-ish, but the world is vast, and so the agent is interacting with this vast world, which is much, much bigger than it. And it's really easy to see, why this happens, right? If you think about it, how is it that the agent can't be bigger than the world? Well, the easiest way to think about this is the world has many other agents in it. And if you want to perfectly model the world, you have to model the minds or brains of all those other agents. And so that just by definition is bigger than one agent. There's many other ways to think about this, but I think that's a reasonable way to start. And again, this is just to kind of frame the context of this discussion, because when we're talking about experiments, we need to think about our problem setting. And that really leads to, what are we trying to do? And I always try to think about what my goal is, and when I read a paper, what the researcher's goal is. And often it's not really stated very clearly. And I can think of at least 4 interesting goals you might have when you run an experiment in reinforcement learning. So probably the most common and popular one is to solve a simulator. And so, when you think of chip design and you are running reinforcement learning to find new chip designs, you're interested in the artifact of learning, the thing that comes out at the end. You're interested in like the new chip design. You're not interested in the learning process along the way. You're not even necessarily interested in some generalizable thing that can be deployed to create a new chip design. You really just want a better chip design. And this is in contrast to something like Pong, where no one's actually interested in the optimal policy in Pong. That's really, really boring. There's no scientific value in that. There's no commercial value in that. You would not be interested in optimal policies in Atari. So what's another category of thing that people do? And of course, this is probably an interest that has been inherited from supervised learning, which is the interest in getting state-of-the-art performance on benchmark. And so benchmarks are meant to crystallize key research problems, key unresolved challenges that if you actually do good on these, if you move these numbers up, it should be because you have algorithmic innovation. That doesn't always happen. Benchmarks become stale like MNIST. It creates gatekeeping and over focus on a small set of benchmarks, but in principle, this is what a benchmark is for. There's a third category, which is like the Rich Sutton category, I'll call it, which is, using reinforcement learning as a lens for understanding intelligence, mind, learning. The idea that it's easier than studying animals and humans if we just try to build intelligence and then reverse engineer all its key principles. And then the fourth one, which I'm quite interested lately, is moving reinforcement learning towards real world deployments, like things that actually, the algorithmic innovations you have that you then test in your papers, the goal of those experiments is to try to give some insight about how these things will work in the real world. And so I think for almost all these categories, you want to compare algorithms carefully and scientifically. You don't want to mislead yourself that your benchmark results are correct and the ranking is correct. You don't want to mislead yourself about how intelligence works. You don't want to mislead yourself about an algorithm being useful for deployment when it isn't. So even when you're just thinking the empirical side of reinforcement learning, you could have at least these four goals. And it's really, really important that in your own mind, you're very clear about which one of these are, because it really shapes what you should do. So, given that kind of stage, I have a pretty simple outline for the talk. There's basically two parts. The first part is don't waste your own time, which is basically some knowledge about empirical work in reinforcement learning that I've kind of gathered over the years. And then the second part is about the impact of hyperparameters in reinforcement learning and how there really is a crisis going on, and we need to deal with that crisis if we ever want to have reinforcement algorithms that operate in the real world and actually matter in any kind of clearly measurable way. So to start off, we can think about reinforcement learning as a branch of science. But it's a little weird, right? Because science is the study of the natural world. We pose questions and we try to get answers. And in the natural world, the questions come from the natural world, like how is it that bees communicate where pollen is, or how do plate tectonics work, or all those kind of questions. The questions are derived from the natural world. Whereas in reinforcement learning, we're studying computing. And so it's special because we invent our own problem settings. We come up with like the environment, the MVP. We come up with the agent, which is a solution method, and the environment protocol. We put all these things together, which is very, very different from the natural world, because all these things are invented things by us to then answer a scientific question. And when we do that, when we invent all those things, we then create this complex dynamical system, and then we want to understand that dynamical system. That's kind of what reinforcement learning is in a nutshell, is that we invent dynamical systems that don't really exist in the world, and then we want to understand that really complicated system, rather than going to a system that arises in nature and studying that. But at the end of the day, the goal for almost all branches of RL and all branches of science is, whether you're an empiricist, a theorist, an algorithm designer, the whole goal of everything you're doing is new insights and understanding, which is knowledge, and then communicating that out to the world. That's what scientists do. That's what reinforcement learning researchers should be doing. And so if it's hard to imagine what you're doing as new insights and understanding, you might be doing something that isn't really scientific research. And the founders of our field came from animal learning. I learned a lot about animal learning when I was in my PhD because Jim Kehoe, a well-known animal learning psychologist from Australia, would come visit us almost every summer. And he did a lot of experiments with rabbits. And I was just, astonished by how careful of a scientist he was and all the things they had to deal with. And it really inspired me as a computational researcher. So he did these eye blink experiments with rabbits. So the picture's a little bit scary, but the rabbit's okay. And you put this rabbit in an apparatus, and basically you want to do classical conditioning experiments where you play a tone or a flashlight, one of the two. You give some stimuli, then you wait some time, and then you puff air into the rabbit's eye. And when you puff air into the rabbit's eye, it's going to close an inner membrane. It has like two eyelets. So it has the nictitating membrane in its eye. And the goal of classical conditioning is to get the rabbit to associate the cue, the tone, with the eye puff because it can figure out the timing. And what we see is that when you pair the stimuli with the eye puff later, the rabbit eventually begins to predict it quite well, and it actually closes the inner eye membrane in advance of when the eye puff will happen. Um, but when you think about this experiment, it's really difficult. Like, they have to do these with real rabbits, and they only have so many of them, and they only have so many researchers to run the experiments. Um, and so they have to run rabbits through these repeated trials. And the researchers are very, very careful scientists. They pay attention to making sure the lighting in the lab is always the same. And that if they pick up the rabbit and pet it once on the head as they carry it over, they're going to do that every single time to every single rabbit. They're not wearing scents. They're monitoring the temperature, because then all these things can skew their results. And we don't have to worry about nearly as many of those things, but we should be inspired by that kind of scientific care, that kind of attention to detail, because it comes up in other way in our experiments. Because at the end of the day, reinforced learning is a lot easier than animal learning. Like I said, we get to construct the environment, the agent, the experiment protocol, all of that stuff. The caveat here, robotics is much closer to animal learning, and that's very, very hard. And that requires a whole different discussion, I think. We can control and isolate sources of variation. Like when they do experiments with rodents running mazes, sometimes they have dumb rats and they actually exclude them from the experiment. We can control the genetic differences in our agents. We're not just subject to some weird population. We can instrument every single aspect of our experiment. We can collect any data we want, whatever, and then we can analyze it after the fact. If you run a dozen rabbits through a training protocol that takes a couple weeks, and at the end you're like, crap, I forgot to measure these things. You have to go get more rabbits and do it again. Our experiments can run really fast. We can even change them on the fly. And probably most importantly is we can run our experiments massively in parallel. The parallelism in the rabbit experiments is just due to how many lab technicians you have and how many rabbits you have. And then, of course, we can do this way, way, way faster than real time. I know some folks that have optimized the Atari emulator, and they can get it to run at something like 60,000 frames per second. So that's just amazing when you think about the power for us to do lots and lots of experiments very, very quickly. And that's why many people decide to work on understanding intelligence by working in computer science, because of all these things. And all those things are true. The problem is easier. We've got lots of inspiration from good scientists operating in other fields. And yet I would declare that the empirical practices in RL are really, really bad. And so let's talk about why Adam has this belief that he would use one slide with red letters and say empirical practices are bad, because it's a very judgmental thing to say. So just to kind of motivate you with the current, setting or the way things are in the community right now, let's do a case study. So we were actually trying to run some experiments on some actor-critic methods, and this case study kind of came up by accident because one of my students was trying to build on a well-known algorithm, and they did this case study just because they were trying to reproduce some results from the literature so that they could know their implementation of that algorithm was correct. So what's the goal here? There's a well-known result in the literature with well-known policy gradient algorithms. Can we reproduce it? And so this was work done by my student Samuel Newman, and so he was trying to run SAC and DDPG in one of the Majoka environments, and so this was the result he got when he did like 30 seeds and trying to match everything that was done in the paper, except he used more seeds than they did because they did something silly like 3 or 5 seeds, and we'll talk about that later. And so the things to note about this are the performance is way off the mark. Like the average performance for SAC here was 8,000, and we expect something closer to 16,000, especially if you look at the spinning up baselines. So that was one problem. And then also these error bars are absolutely massive. The ones in the reported results were very tight to the mean line, which should always cause you to be suspicious. But so we have two things. We have way more variance than we expect, and we have really poor performance. And the other kind of thing to suggest that these results were strange in the original paper was that they said that these error bars or the shaded regions were the difference between the min performance and the max performance across runs, which you would expect would be massive, but they showed very tight error bars. So, something very suspicious is going on here. And so, despite all Sam's efforts, he just could not reproduce the result using 30 runs. He did an extensive hyperparameter sweep, starting with the hyperparameters reported in the paper and then trying other ones as well, ablating the architecture and a bunch of implementation choices. He just couldn't get there, couldn't reproduce the result. So what's happening? Some of the things that made this really, really hard. The repository contains wrappers for 2 different code bases, and it was really unclear which implementation that they were using, especially for the baselines. Neither the paper nor the repository specified the hyperparameters for the baseline method. So we were showing the baseline as DDPG. So no information about that baseline or how it was tuned. And the repo also included algorithmic components that could be turned on and off in SAC that weren't even mentioned in the paper. So you expect that major things that are important performance are going to be mentioned in both the paper and in the code. So we took a Mythbusters approach. I don't know if you've ever seen the Mythbusters show, but the idea is like someone says, using your cell phone on a plane can cause the plane to crash. And so they test the myth, and then they find out it's like totally not true. And then they try to see what they would have to do to make it so that the using your cell phone could actually mess with the plane. And so they have to turn up the radio transmitter in the cell phone like 1,000 times more for it to actually affect the cockpit. So here we were taking the approach of, well, what would we have to do to match the result in that paper? And so, Sam was just kind of playing around, and he noticed that some runs of SAC in this problem were very, very, very good, and some of them were bad. And he also noticed that the code includes seed search. So there's a module in the code that says, find the best seeds for this thing by trying many, many seeds and then picking the best. There's also, of course, the possibility that the students compiling the results for this paper were just tweaking the algorithm and hitting rerun every time. And then when you do that kind of process, if you keep running it and adding new things, eventually you'll just get 5 lucky seeds, and maybe that's what happened. And of course, there was one other undocumented choice, which is actually really important, which is there is initial exploration period in SAC. So for the first 10,000 steps, SAC just follows a random policy and collects data, and only after 10,000 steps does the agent start actually learning and changing the policy. So now if we look at this plot, we can see that the red line is SAC with seed search. So if you use their seed search code, you get something very close to their paper. If you take SAC and then do this exploration period, we denote it as EP. You can also get really good performance. If you combine those 2 things, you get the best of both of them. And there's 2 things to notice. One is we're getting close to the performance that we expect and what was reported in the paper. And 2, now the error bars are much, much tighter. And so when you compare that to the result of the black line, which is just a straightforward implementation of SAC following what the paper said, but with a hyperparameter search, that's a huge gap in performance. And so actually, in set here, I just have the original plot from the paper. And so you can see that SAC line in orange looks a lot like our green SAC line with the expiration period. But notice their DDPG line. It's really low, and it has bad dips in performance. And so we just took DDPG and tried to make it better. So we did a broader hyperparameter search. We also tried different action selection mechanisms with noise. And we also found some bugs in their code of how they were updating DDPG. And when we did all those things, now all of a sudden we've got DDPG with this expiration period, the yellow line. Those are very, very, very close in performance. Now it would be hard to make this claim that you could definitely say SAC's better here, but you wouldn't say that SAC is, astonishingly better, which is what the inset figure is definitely suggesting. And so, the take-home messages here are that it was really, really hard to reproduce the result. It was dependent on choices in the code that weren't well documented. And, the same basic learning system without some special tricks or some implementation details can lead to very, very, very different performance. This is just a reproducibility nightmare. And there's also a bunch of bad empirical practices that were happening here. And so, looking at this inset plot, the fact that they're only using a handful of seeds, but they have these tight error bars, these are all bad things that we're going to talk about in the rest of the lecture. And so, that case study is just to motivate you that a very well-known result, a very popular and performant algorithm can suffer a lot of bad empirical practices, which then makes it difficult to do follow-up research. All those things are happening in our community, but it's not because people aren't, putting their hands up and saying, here's a better way to do it. So here's several better ways to do it. There's this really nice paper called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Statistical Comparisons in Reinforcement Learning. This is basically just a paper that helps people understand different confidence intervals that you can compute in reinforcement learning. What are the statistical assumptions of those confidence intervals, and what happens when those assumptions are violated? That's mostly with artificial data, but it is very, very interesting. Dealing with hyperparameters in reinforcement learning when comparing algorithms. This is work by Scott Jordan and some other folks in my lab. And basically the take-home message here is that if you're trying to rank algorithms and you have hyperparameters involved, it requires way, way, way more runs and data than you would ever imagine. And that we probably have to move away from ranking algorithms if the systems are large because we just don't have enough compute to do it. I've always enjoyed this Revisiting Rainbow paper because basically they took the idea of the rainbow agent and said, look, we can get very similar insights looking at Mountain Car and Cartpole and Mini Atari and use way less compute compared to running it on the Atari suite, which is very, very expensive. And people have put forward things like IQM to evaluate performance, and the idea there is that you drop the lowest performing and the highest performing because those can skew things. But I've had a lot of conversations about this paper with the authors of it, including Pablo, and the motivation for that paper was Atari, which is some games are very easy, like Pong. So learning happens very, very quickly, and it doesn't really separate algorithms. And some games are really, really hard, like Montezuma's Revenge, and all the agents perform poorly. So those things kind of skew the unit estimates. And so you're dropping the worst and best environments. But in practice, people use this very poorly. They apply it within one environment. So they say, okay, I'll run a Mountain Car and I'll drop the best performing and worst performing seeds. That's not what IQM is for. If you don't believe me, email Pablo and ask him about it. IQM is for aggregating performance across multiple environments, not just one. People use this wrong everywhere, and we really need to get the word out that that's, because then you have to argue that in your environment, in your domain, that dropping the worst performing seeds is acceptable. In Atari, you can make arguments about the worst performing games, but like if you have a critical application, dropping the worst performing seed is just straight up misleading. So running good experiments is possible, but you have to care about not wasting your own time. And that's the message at the end of the day. If you run poor experiments, if you have misleading experiments, people can read your paper pretty quickly, figure out that your experiments are bad, and they'll just ignore your paper. The person that's wasting the most time is you, because you invested so much time to create a paper, to set up a bunch of experiments, and that's just a waste of compute and your own time. So that was kind of the first part of don't waste your time, through the lens of a case study and some papers that can show us a better way to do things. But let's talk about like this one of the most controversial things, which is like how many runs, people often call the seeds, but how many runs or trials do you need to have good, trustable experimental results? So to motivate this, let's just look at some data. So this is DQN running on Mountain Car, and we're plotting, the x-axis is basically time environment interactions. The y-axis, the numbers don't really matter very much. It's the episodic return in Mountain Car. And so this is a fairly typical learning curve. It starts off low and comes up. There's a little bit of a weird dip in this, but this is averaged over 200 runs in Mountain Car. But if we look at the individual runs, this is what produced this average. So each one of these blue curves is an actual run in Mountain Car with DQN. And you can see that a bunch of them, the performance just absolutely craters down to the worst possible performance, and it oscillates all over the place. And I think it's fairly fair to say that looking at the average curve, you would never have guessed that the seeds were this bad, right? Because the shaded regions are fairly tight. We use 200 runs. but this is the underlying data. So any one of these blue curves is like running a reinforcement learning agent driving a car. Would this be acceptable performance? Are we just happy when the average performance is good? I find this profoundly unsatisfactory. And let's look at some more data. If this was an experiment I ran on an n-step off-pulse TD method on Baird's counterexample. It's a famous example that breaks TD. And when you show the data and you actually look at everything that your agent does, which is exactly what we're doing on this previous slide, right? We're looking at the underlying data, not just the average performance. Here, I just plotted all the runs as an individual line. And so if you look at the mean performance is basically that flat little hump. And note that this is a log scale on the y-axis, and that's why it kind of has this drawdown shape. But one of the runs shoots way off, but then comes back down. So there's kind of two interesting things here. One interesting thing here is that one run is really bad, which would be completely hidden by the average, but also that if you look at this, it does come back down. So that gives you a little bit more information with the system. The performance can get bad, but then it can recover. And I think both those conclusions are interesting, and neither of them are visible if you just look at average learning curves. But it's actually way, way worse than you think. So a student in our group ran this experiment. We're trying to simulate many different reinforcement learning labs, trying to rank 4 different algorithms using as few seeds as possible. So the setup here is, imagine you have 10,000 labs that ran the same RL experiment. You have 4 algorithms and you want to use as few seeds as possible. How many seeds do you think you would need to be statistically confident that you correctly identified the best algorithm? And we're going to do this on really small toy problems. And so the way you can do this is basically you can actually run each algorithm 250 times, and then you can compute the confidence intervals. And if the ranking from the 250 runs of all the confidence intervals doesn't overlap in any way, then we can pretty confident in our ranking of the algorithms, and we'll take that as the true ranking. And that's exactly what we did. Ran each algorithm many, many, many times, and there was clear differences between them. So that's the ground truth. But if you only use 3 runs, which is what we did here, and then you compare the ranking of algorithms by running a 3-run or 3-seed experiment 10,000 times and compare that to the true ranking, 47% of the time in Acrobat, you came up with the wrong ranking, 54% in Cliff World, 22% in Mountain Car. Okay, so basically the message here is if you only do 3 runs and you did that experiment over and over and over across many different labs, 47% of those labs would get the ranking of Acrobat incorrect. So let's extend it out. Let's use some more runs here. So if you use 10 runs, Acrobat goes down to 31%, but we're still seeing 31%, 19%, 16% of incorrect rankings with 10 seeds. And by modern standards, I'm sure if you flip through the proceedings of NeurIPS from last year, 10 would be on the high side for number of runs in a reinforced learning experiment. And we can pull it out to 30 and 10 and even, or 100, and even at 100, sometimes you can still get the ranking wrong. And so I find this kind of stunning. These are very small environments. They're not particularly noisy environments. But if you're not using enough seeds, you're going to be misleading yourself. You're putting yourself at risk of literally making the wrong conclusion. Like, saying that SAC is better than DQN on this environment. That could be something that you could say and it would just be wrong. And so I think we really have to care about this and pay attention to this. And if looking at the data and seeing the underlying variability and seeing the structure of the data that's hidden by the average and seeing the evidence that if you try to rank algorithms, you can totally get it wrong if you don't use enough seeds, if none of that really appealed to you, you're not worried about it, then I'll appeal from a science angle, right? Scientists don't report results from studies of 3 rats. They would get laughed out of their conferences and publication venues because people would say, that's just 3 rats, that's ridiculous. And we should feel just as ridiculous reporting results from so few runs. It's interesting because in the natural sciences, robustness and generality of result is actually established over time, right? Like I publish my study, maybe my study uses 30 rats in some conditions. So some other research lab in the world, they do a different population of rats. They have a slightly different setup because they can't exactly copy mine, but they get similar results. And then eventually it flows into, they start using slightly different rat subspecies and variations of tasks. And again, they establish the generality of result. And that happens in the natural sciences because there's no really other way to do it because they're working in the real world. We don't have to do it that way. We can ensure perfect reproducibility, and we can explore those generalizations on our own. We don't have to rely on other labs to do it, and we can do all of this much faster. So we have science is easier in computers, so we should be doing at least as good as the other sciences and probably better because we can. Okay, so maybe I've convinced you with the case study and with showing you the data that you need more runs and that we need to think more clearly about how we want to aggregate performance and present it. Let's look at some statistical tools we can use because there's lots of them out there. So, we already asked, is this a useful summary of an individual agent's performance? And this was 200 runs, mean learning curve with the shaded region corresponding to 95% confidence intervals. And so I already showed you the data. That's what's being summarized here. I don't know if people are able to answer questions right now. Is that possible through the setup?
Yes, that's possible. They can answer the question in the chat box, and they can raise their hand, and I can give them microphone access.
Great. So let's make this a little bit interactive, and let's look at this setup and say, okay, we have 95% confidence intervals and 200 runs, but the shaded region is definitely not reflective of the underlying data. So maybe we've made an invalid assumption here, an invalid statistical assumption. Can anyone suggest some assumptions that we might have made that are not valid? There are no wrong answers. Can I repeat the question? Okay, so the question is, if I look at this plot on the left, the black line with gray shaded regions, those shaded regions are quite small, but the underlying data shows absolutely massive variation in individual performance. So something's wrong with my shaded region, and what's wrong could probably be driven by some sort of assumptions I've made. So does anyone have an idea of what assumptions my 95% confidence interval is making that's not valid? This goes back to your Stats 101 course, the one where they made you do all the formulas for hypothesis testing and stuff, but they also told you a bunch of assumptions, and then we all forgot it. Okay, I'm going to move on, but hopefully the next question you guys will have some answers. So a 95% confidence interval assumes a normal distribution. And you have to show me that your underlying data is normally distributed. The other thing that's happening here is that a 95% confidence interval is assuming that we know the variance, that the variance is known. But here we're estimating the variance from samples, and so we haven't accounted for that additional uncertainty for estimating the variance from samples. And so, let's see if it's a normal distribution then. So let's look at this experiment, SARSA lambda with tau coding mountain car. This one was DQM with a neural network. That's going to be an awful distribution. Let's look at something that probably has a nicer distribution, which is a classic method like tau coding, which typically has much lower variance in performance. So this was work done by Raksha. And so basically, let's do the typical 3-run experiment that people do in papers. Here you go. Here's the histogram of performance for 3 runs. Can you tell me if that's normal or not? There's no way you can know from 3 runs. We could look at more runs, 5 runs, even more runs. Even then, making the argument that this is a normal distribution is very, very, very unlikely. And then we go up to 1,000 runs. Okay, it's kind of having a bump shape. And then at the very end, after 1,000 runs, we see it's sort of Gaussian shape, but there's definitely a skew to this distribution. So assuming that this is a symmetric Gaussian distribution would be incorrect. Yeah, so it's not about calculating the standard deviation. Standard deviation gives us no notion of confidence. What we're trying to do here is, understand the underlying distribution and see what statistical tools we should be using. So here I'm declaring that even with Sarsaland and tile coding on Mountain Car, we don't actually have a symmetric normal distribution, even if we do 1,000 runs, which no one ever does. And in fact, if you look at something like CartPoll, the performance actually can be multimodal. And so looking at mean performance in here, the mean performance says that on average, we're balancing the poll for 125 steps. But when you look at the distribution of performance, this is just like the histograms I was doing, except there's a kernel density estimation going on here to kind of smooth out the empirical distribution. But what this says is that an agent is very likely to balance the poll for 35 steps. That's where the first mode of this distribution is centered. It's less likely to balance the poll for over 250 steps, but that's where the other bump is. And it's actually very unlikely to balance the poll for 125 steps. So we have a multimodal distribution. Again, that completely violates our assumptions we were making when we were building our standard normal 95% confidence intervals. And it's worse than that. It's not just that what does the distribution look like at the end of learning? Of course, we're computing learning curves, and learning curves are summarizing all throughout the learning progress. Things are changing as the agent runs. And so let's look at this mountain car experiment. The left is the distribution, the right is the point on the learning curve that we're at, and we're seeing it's sometimes multimodal, sometimes it's skewed to one side, sometimes it's skewed to another side. The distribution is dramatically changing all throughout the run. So any assumptions we'd be making based on the data just at the end of the run would be inaccurate for all the data in the middle of the run. So this is very, very, very complicated, and just assuming things are normal, just assuming that a few seeds are enough, are just statistically invalid. So we need to check our assumptions. So like when we think about confidence intervals, this is another thing that people often get wrong, which is confidence intervals versus variance. Confidence intervals reflect our confidence that the true performance is within some range, right? We have our line for the empirical mean, and the confidence intervals is supposed to say, with some statistical confidence, we believe that the true mean is somewhere in this shaded region. And so, we often do this by plotting mean learning curve with standard error shading. Again, standard error assumes a normal distribution and assumes known variance. But given enough data, a confidence interval goes to 0. That's its job, right? Because it has some term in the denominator that's equal to the number of runs. And like I said, assuming known variance, things like that is very, very problematic. Does your data even match those assumptions? Have you ever even looked at it? Can you tell from 3 samples? We've already established up to this point that those things, no one checks. And if you did check, you'd never tell from 3 samples anyway. And that's just the distribution again, just to help you see that even when you're in the 10 seed regime, which again, by modern standards would be considered a lot, there's no way that someone can make the argument that this is a normal distribution. That's just preposterous. Another thing that someone might try, they might say, oh, well, I run a test of normality with 5 seeds, and it said that my data was normal. Again, that test of normality has assumptions, and certainly it's not valid with 5 seeds. But there are better things you can do. Like the very simplest one you could do is a student T confidence interval, which you have the degrees of freedom, which is related to the number of runs you have. And so basically it's going to get wider if you have fewer runs. That's still making assumptions that are almost certainly not valid in a lot of our experiments. Like definitely it wouldn't work with that CartPoll data because it's assuming a Gaussian distribution. Bootstrap confidence intervals, they make less distributional assumptions. They're not a silver bullet. You can't just use them with 2 seeds and think that they're accurate. But here I've kind of plotted a few of them for different parameters of student T and the bootstrap one. And you can see these are wider intervals. They're more representative of the underlying variance we're seeing. but it's not quite the full story. And so another thing you can do is just look at all the different ones you could compute. So here we're looking at DQN and puddle world, and we are looking at uh, computing confidence intervals in different ways. Berenstein, percentile bootstrap, student t, standard error. And with 10 runs, the bootstrap, student t, and standard error all actually missed the true mean, even though they were narrow enough to probably be satisfactory in our point of view, but they actually missed the true mean. The Berenstein one is very, very broad. It makes very few assumptions, and it captured the true mean. But also, it basically tells you the performance can be anywhere in this giant range. When you increase things to 50 runs, now they all start catching them except for the standard error. And so with more runs, there's more tools that are appropriate to you, but still, even with 50 runs, the standard error actually missed the mean. And so I like Andy Patterson uses this expression that you can be confidently incorrect. But you can do other things. So those were confidence intervals, which is trying to compute some statistical notion of confidence. Another thing that people do interchangeably, which is not the same, is sometimes they'll make their shaded regions to be variance or standard deviation. That's not a measure of confidence because that isn't something that can go to zero with infinite sampling. It's measuring just the variation in the underlying distribution. And so people often interchange those two things, and they're not interchangeable. You need to say whether you're using measuring confidence or measuring variation in the distribution and explain why you're making these choices. People almost never do. Here's another tool you can use, which is called a tolerance interval. Basically, you're looking at the interval, the shaded region are like the percentiles of the performance, plus some uncertainty factor, some fudge factor at the top and the bottom based on the number of runs you're doing. This is not a confidence interval. This is something that's talking about variation in the distribution. And so when we look at our DQN average performance in black there, and now if you look at the tolerance interval, it's almost filling the range. Just like our individual seeds were all over the place, this is showing you that the performance is all over the place. And then we include the red line just to show you that it's not always the case that the tolerance interval is the whole plot. It can be tighter. And so if you have a good algorithm that has better performance more reliably, then you can get tighter and tighter confidence or tolerance intervals. So if you really want to show what your data looks like and you don't want to plot all the individual seeds because you want to compare things, then this is a pretty nice tool to use. Now, I can say all that to you. I've said this to my students. I've said this to people at conferences. I've said this to authors when I'm reviewing their papers, and they always respond, yeah, all that statistics stuff, all the assumption stuff, yeah, but do I really need to do it? Because I don't want it. And so that's the common reaction. My agent environment is huge, and doing more runs requires too much compute. I'm doing Rainbow and Atari, and it's too expensive already, so all I can do is 3 seeds. And what the person is saying to you is saying, okay, I want to run an experiment that I don't have the resources to run, so let's just pretend that the result means that what I claim it does. I'm not going to provide you proper evidence. Let's just pretend. And I think that's basically what they're asking you to do. And my solution is, yeah, sometimes things are too big and we just can't do them. They're infeasible. So you have to ask empirical questions for which you have data and time because you have deadlines and the compute to answer. And to me, this is analogous to, I'm not a theory person. It'd be really fun for me to add some cool convergence proofs in one of my papers. And so I worked out halfway through the proof, but I couldn't really figure it out. And I couldn't get Chabas-Epesvari to help me. So then I just kind of made up the rest of the proof and said, hey, can we just pretend that the rest of the proof is correct, even though I didn't do the work and I didn't have access to the resources to make the proof correct? That's what an empiricist is asking you when they use improper statistical tools and they don't provide evidence to support their claims. There's a question here on the side, or a statement maybe. How about box plots where the normality assumption doesn't hold and the sample size is small? Any kind of plots, there's going to be a definition for the percentiles of that plot. So yes, that plot is telling you things about the percentiles of the distribution and the whiskers are telling you about the min and max. That's fine. It's not making really a lot of assumptions, but one thing it is doing is it's probably misleading. The number of times myself personally and my students have run experiments where, because we were doing exploratory research, we were only using 5 or 10 trials, and we ran the experiment and we got a conclusion, and then when we ran it for more, the conclusion flipped. That's what happens when you work in small sample regimes, and no statistical tools are going to get you out of that. This even happened when I was working with my postdoc, Tom Ferguson. He was doing experiments with people, getting them to solve bandit tasks, and he had 20 participants. And from those 20 participants, he was measuring their neural activity, and there was a clear conclusion emerging about one neural signal in the brain and how it related to how they explored in the bandit task. And when he added more participants, that signal just vanished. This happens in the natural sciences. It happens in reinforcement learning. You can try to make box plots and all kinds of other visualizations, but the real risk is that you're literally just fooling yourself. So don't do it. So everything becomes harder and harder when we think about how our learning systems work. So far, I was just talking about given some set of hyperparameters, and I want to compare agents, then how much data do I need? What assumptions are I making? How can I even make those comparisons? We have to actually remember that our agents are these things that have many, many hyperparameters, and we can tune those hyperparameters in different ways, and that will impact our conclusions also and make these comparisons even harder. So let's talk about that. So one immediate thing that I showed in the case study, which was the untuned DDPG baseline, which is basically misrepresenting the performance of other methods. And this is a common trap that people fall into. What they'll do is they'll come up with a new environment. Let's call it like game X. So they invented a new game, and they want to try this new agent they came up with and DQN on game X. Okay, so you compare your agent and DQN on game X, and you just use the hyperparameters for nature DQN, the one that they use for Atari. The problem here is that DQN was highly tuned for Atari. DQN is like a family of methods, and you change the hyperparameters, you fundamentally change how it works. And how well DQN works is very, very environment dependent. And so you'll most likely do way, way better with DQN in game X if you just retune its hyperparameters. And we ran exactly this experiment. We took nature DQN's hyperparameters, we applied them to a different MDP. It was probably something like Acrobat. And so you can see the black line, awful. And then we took our new algorithm that we had tuned for Acrobat because we were developing the algorithm and testing in Acrobat. So you always kind of tune your algorithm as you're working with and improving it. So looking at the black and blue line, you might be like, oh man, I can go write a paper now because I have something that's way better than nature DQN on this new environment, game X. And so now you think you have something really special in your hands. But of course, if you just do the work of retuning the hyperparameters of DQN, you can get it to perform much better. And now you don't have a paper because your algorithm is actually just completely subsumed by DQN. And so that's an easy way that you can mislead yourself by not tuning the baselines. And that comes up because our algorithms have so many hyperparameters. And I'm going to touch on this more later. So I've already said all these things. The new algorithm is highly tuned for game X, and the reason is because you have this idea to develop a new algorithm, and you're like, I need to test on something, so I come up with this new MDP game X, and then as you're working on your algorithm, like I need to fix this, I need to do that. You're running it over and over and over in game X, and you're actually just really overfitting the game X. And so what's people's reaction? Again, these are kind of like pretend dialogues that I have with other researchers. The common reaction is like, well, DQN works on everything, right? And like, no, that's not true. DQN can't do well on Mountain Car. Nobody does that. Too bad. It doesn't matter if no one does that. We're trying to be scientists here. And it's too much compute to do that. And again, that's back to my earlier answer. Don't try to turn experiments that you don't have the compute to run. That's not a valid defense. So what's the solution? How do we get out of this? Well, one thing you do is if you want to compare to some other algorithm like DQN or SAC or something else, use the environments that those algorithms were developed for, because the designers of those algorithms already tuned them for those problems. So you don't have to do retuning of their hyperparameters. And there are other solutions to this challenge, but we can talk about them later because I want to kind of keep on track here. And so, what are the key messages up until now? You need more runs or replications in your experiments than you think. I want you to think like a statistician. Think about the assumptions you're making. What are the distributions involved? What's a good way to summarize the distribution you have? What are the assumptions you're making? These are all important, necessary steps whenever you use a statistical tool. Don't just use it because it's built into the programming language you're doing. Try to think about it. Untuned baselines are profoundly misleading. Probably a large percentage of papers out in the literature are reporting untuned baseline results and then claiming they're better than those, which is not surprising and it's really easy to avoid. And this one comes up over and over and over, but appealing to the fallacy of authority, right? To say that just because some highly cited paper does something doesn't make it okay. People say this all the time. Well, all the papers from DeepMind or all the papers in the literature do this, so it's only fair that I'm allowed to do this. I've heard authors say this. I've heard reviewers say it. Misleading results. There's nothing to do about fairness here. It's just invalid empirical practices, and we need to get rid of it because it's going to really cause problems in our community going forward, and it already has. So, this has been a passion of mine for a very, very long time. We try to write up about as much of this as we could in this paper called Empirical Design and Reinforced Learning. It's published in Gimler. And in there, we talk about best practices, common pitfalls. We give lots and lots and lots of examples with different algorithms and different environments. And we've also open sourced all the code. So I think this is part of this talk is just a small teaser for this paper, but we spent a lot of time working on this, and we think it conveys a lot of the things that I've touched on today and much, much more. So please take a look at that paper. It really does try to provide a guide for new researchers of how to think about and run good experiments. So maybe I'll take a pause there to see if there are any questions, and then otherwise I'll go into the second part. I see that there's a comment about, to do justice to baselines, we should report all the hyperparameter configurations we tested so far, or we're reporting only the best suffice. Yeah, reporting the best I hate hyperparameter searches. I like looking at many different hyperparameters to understand the sensitivity of an algorithm, like how much its performance changes with respect to changing those hyperparameters. But reporting the best is very, very misleading because it's something we'd never be able to do in practice. Like, I work on water treatment plants, and I can't do a hyperparameter search on a water treatment plant. So this idea of reporting the best is something you can only kind of do in simulators. And I think it's just, we should be more worried about default hyperparameters and how robust performance is to those, rather than doing a very expensive search and then looking at best performing artifacts. Is there any other questions or comments?
One person wants to talk. Can I give them the microphone access?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
First of all, thank you for this presentation. And so far, it was quite shocking and at the same time relating, because I had a lot of these experiences when I was trying to implement those algorithms in those famous papers, and I couldn't get the same result. But the thing that I have in mind is that you said if we don't have enough compute, so we shouldn't, do stuff that need those computes. But the thing is, if we want to think this way, only giants company that have access to clusters and dozens of GPU can do the real science, and we couldn't really do so much in that area. So I was thinking, isn't there any more reliable statistical tool that can help with pure sample? I have, for example, I don't know why I have this, but I have entropy in mind. I think reporting entropy is kind of saying that how distribution is really um, showing itself. It's a stochasticity. I want to say, I don't know how to phrase it. And yes, this is my question. Isn't there any approach that with less compute power we can do the real science?
Okay, so you've made some assumptions there. One assumption you made is that I'm not talking to the tech companies, and I'm definitely talking to the tech companies. So let's imagine a hypothetical experiment. You want to run, not you, DeepMind or Google or someone else wants to run an experiment where they rank 5 different algorithms on Minecraft. The amount of compute, the amount of random seeds they would need, the amount of hyperparameter tuning that they would need to do to convince us that these were not untuned algorithms is more compute than they have. Like, that's why I pointed to Scott Jordan's paper. Go take a look at Scott Jordan's paper that I referenced earlier, and I can share these slides with the class. That shows you the amount of compute you need to make ranking type experiments. It's more than the tech companies have. So first of all, it's not just universities, it's tech companies too. The real issue that people are running into, and that's what this paper is about, is ranking is very, very expensive and probably more expensive than we can afford. And ranking experiments are rarely what we want anyway. What is the point of an experiment when we're talking about science? It's to uncover the answer to a specific question. Ranking is one type of question, and it's not even a particularly interesting one. It says, which one of these in ideal scenarios performs better than the other in this particular environment? That's not a question that a scientist almost ever asks in another field, because it doesn't uncover very much understanding or knowledge. And that's the original goal, right? Understanding these systems better. That's only about performance. There's all kinds of other questions you could ask, like, does this exploration algorithm explore more of the state space? Or, you can go through very specific empirical questions, and Scott called this scientific experimentation, which is form a very well scoped scientific question, and then oftentimes the compute required to answer that is much, much smaller because we're not doing the ranking thing. So the ranking is the problem. The other assumption you kind of made is that ranking and big systems is, the real science, and that, us with small computers, and by the way, I'm with small computers too because I'm at a university, that we can't do the real science. I would actually argue the opposite. What they're doing is not real science. What they're doing is they're doing demonstrations. Like the original DQN paper showed the way Vlad Ming ran the experiment was he ran the copy of DQN in each one of the environments, and he looked at the learning curve, which was very noisy up and down in each game. And then he just reported the performance at the peak of the learning curve, not at the end, not under some sort of principled thing. And he did that because he just wanted to know what was possible. That's what those results are like. Those results are demonstrations of what's possible. People at universities like us can then go behind them and ask very careful scientific questions and do the science work behind the demonstration. So I challenge you guys to look to do the science work, not do the ranking or the demonstration work, because it's of little value and it's too expensive for anyone to do. And I think that's what you were kind of doing with your suggestion of entropy. You were thinking about different questions you could ask, different setups you could use. That's what we need to do. We need to be clever, because if it's not possible, it's not possible. And are there some other statistical tools that I haven't mentioned? Absolutely. But there's a fundamental thing of, if I want to report the performance of a very stochastic process from 3 seeds, and then I want to rank things, I'm going to say right now, and I'm going to yell it at the top of my lungs, that's not possible. You can't do it unless the system is very, very deterministic or the variance is extremely low. And we know the opposite is true. These systems are incredibly stochastic. Any other questions?
I see. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll keep going then. Okay, the second part, which is shorter, so don't worry, we're not going to keep you guys up all night. The second part of this is about hyperparameters. And we already touched on the fact that hyperparameters make all of this much, much worse. In supervised learning, we have really principled methods of dealing with model selection and hyperparameters like cross-validation. We don't have things like that in reinforced learning. And in fact, things in reinforced learning are kind of a mess. So when we think about the hyperparameters, like let's consider DQN. DQN has 16 hyperparameters. There's hyperparameters to control the optimization. So you think of the atom optimizer or RMS prop, you've got step size, momentum, you've got expiration hyperparameters like the initial epsilon, the minimum epsilon, how you decay between the initial and minimum. We have the neural network architecture, the activation functions, how you initialize the weights. Are you using HE or Xavier or something else? Replay buffers have a minimum size, a max size, a batch size, all these other things. It goes on and on and on. In fact, I just want to jump to this one because I think this is the more natural order. This is a plot that my student Jacob made for our NeurIPS paper last year, which was showing over time different algorithms and the number of hyperparameters. So plot starts in 1983 with like actor critic with eligibility traces and Q-learning. And we can see that we have 3 to 4 hyperparameters for these methods. Even DynaQ Plus, which is a planning algorithm, has like 5 hyperparameters. And we scroll over to 2003, we've got like LSPI and neural fitted Q iteration, handful of hyperparameters. Things right around the time of DQN start exploding. DQN has 16 hyperparameters. Rainbow has 24. Agent 57 has 34 hyperparameters. Dreamer v3 has over 40 hyperparameters. So this is just an exponential trend. Researchers basically are thinking there's no cost to adding hyperparameters. You only get improved performance. And this is building on the first part of the lecture. They're misleading themselves thinking that there's no cost to these hyperparameters. They're misleading themselves and thinking that their rankings are accurate, and they're not. So let's look at the consequences of hyperparameters. So this is a plot of the same algorithm, and you're looking at 2 different Majoku tasks. You're looking at, this is PPO, and we're looking at swimmer and half cheetah. If you look at the red stars, we're seeing here's a hyperparameter setting that does really well in half cheetah, way above mean performance. It's almost outlier performance compared to all the other hyperparameter settings. And it does almost the worst possible in swimmer. These are 2 different environments. And remember, we like to claim in reinforcement learning, especially in Majoku, that, oh yeah, we know the default hyperparameters for PPO. Those are already figured out by the community. Well, apparently not, because you have ones that perform well and ones that perform, the same ones perform really poorly. If you try to tune the hyperparameters across these 2 environments, you find a hyperparameter setting that does work well in both of them. But the idea that there's just some defaults that work well across all of them and that there's no sensitivity to these things is just absolutely not the case. And even dealing with hyperparameters and doing these sweeps and stuff like that, we're making all kinds of assumptions. We're assuming full knowledge and access to the deployment setting, which is we're pretending that the world is half cheetah and that we can interact with the half cheetah environment as much as we want to search for these good hyperparameters. That number 3, that tuning, that search just doesn't count. You can use as much compute as you want. You just report the best performance at the end, and then no one talks about how much time or compute resources or data went into that. We're assuming things don't break. Like, if you try a bad hyperparameter configuration and it finds a terrible policy in half cheetah, no cheetahs get hurt because none of this stuff is real. It's all simulations. It's all games. And these things are true in simulators, but they're not true in the real world. And so at the beginning of this lecture, I said as an empiricist, you have to consider what your goals are in RL research. And that happens at every level of research. So now we're talking about, okay, you're an empirical RL researcher, you're trying to develop a new algorithm, and you're trying to deal with hyperparameters. You have to consider what your goal is again. So one goal is just to prove that your algorithm is best, state of the art. I think that's a terrible goal. I also think it's nearly impossible. So I'm just going to discard right off the bat. You might want to understand how an algorithm's performance changes as you vary key hyperparameters. That's a pretty legitimate goal. It's about understanding and gaining knowledge. And the third goal might be that you have an application that you want to deploy the agent in the real world. And so tuning hyperparameters, say for a water treatment plant, is just not going to be feasible. So what your goal is shapes what you do next. And that's the way it always should be. And so for the rest of this, I'm not going to talk about number 1 because I think it's bad. Number 2, there's lots of discussion of that in Sutton's textbook. You can check that out, or in the empirical design paper I linked to earlier. But let's just talk about the real world because that's kind of fun. So this is the water treatment plant in Drayton Valley, Alberta. It's about 2 hours from Edmonton. And this is an actual application that I have worked on and I'm still working on. And so this is how water treatment works. There's a big 2-foot diameter pipe. Sorry, Canada's metric, but we use imperial measurements for some things. It's very, very weird. Anyway, 2 feet is like big. So there's a huge pipe that comes from the river into the side of this plant. It goes into this big mixing tank here, the big yellow round thing. There's a big fan blade in there mixing the water. We add chemical at that point to make the solids in the water clump together. The pipes then flow into these 2 rectangular boxes here. The yellow at the top is like the top of this box. Those contain filters. And basically we pull the water through pressure through those filters. And the way it works is that the water can only pass through pores in the filter. And so only water molecules can fit through the pores of the filter. All the clumping stuff stays on the outside of the filter. And when you want to clean those filters, you just run the process backwards and you blast off all the stuff on the filters. So that's a water treatment plant in Drayton Valley, Alberta. And right now we have an agent running how much chemical is going into this tank and controlling how the cleaning of the filter happens, and it's running right now as we speak. There are all kinds of fun questions here, right? Like, how quickly do you mix this tank? How much chemical do you put in the water? How the process of cleaning the filter is called backwashing. How do you aerate the water or aerate the filter, like blow little bubbles of air on the filters? Or when do you start the backwash? And when do you turn it off? And all these kind of things. The questions about backwashing, those were parameters configured when the plant was built 10 years ago, and they've never been touched. In fact, the operators didn't even know they could change them. The one about chemical dosing, the operators once a day do a test where they take multiple jars of water and then put more and less chemicals in them. And then they decide which chemical dosing they should do for the rest of the day based on that. So very manual, very labor intensive thing. And the mixing speed is something that's never, ever been changed. But these are all potential for optimization. And so given that kind of problem setup, now let's start thinking about what on earth would you do with hyperparameters in that kind of setup? Because that's a real plant. It produces water for a town. I can't break the plant. I can't waste water. I can't run it in parallel. I can't run it faster than real time. It's not a simulator. So the simple idea here is to build what we call a calibration model. And so what is a calibration model? Well, the picture of it is, and I'll just build in the text for those who like reading the text. Imagine you have a real plant and you have logs and logs and logs of data of operators controlling the plants. And that's exactly what we have in this setting. Operators have been controlling this thing for 10 years. They logged all the sensor values. So it gives you a good idea of how this plant is controlled in a reasonable way. Not optimal, but a reasonable kind of performance. You can then take those logs of data and you can make models of the plant. So you extract a model of the plant from the logs of data. And so I've drawn these little models as pixelated because they're approximations to the real plant. And then once you have those models, you can just run a reinforcement learning experiment. You can say, okay, I have an agent. It has, K different settings of its key hyperparameters. And I'll do an RL experiment with each one of these models. And then whichever one performs the best, I'll then deploy on the plant. So this is exactly what we set up to do. And it's exactly motivated by the plan. We want to pick hyperparameters that will allow good learning in deployment. And so, back to the picture of the agent environment loop, I have an agent, it's interacting with the environment, which is the Drayton Valley water plant, and we're sending over actions and getting back rewards and observations. And of course, so for these calibration experiments, you just replace the true environment with this crappy model of the environment. And so the key thing here is stability. So, people have spent a lot of work in model-based reinforcement learning, trying to build models and then iterating those models forward so that they can do planning. And it's a classic hard problem in reinforcement learning research is when you iterate a model forward, it starts generating invalid states and the model becomes useless as you roll it forward further and further in time. And in fact, in this calibration model experiment, we want to treat it just like the environment. So we actually want to run a whole experiment. So the rollouts have to be 5,000, 50,000, 5 million steps long. And we also never wanted to produce states that are hypothetical or invalid, right? Like, you know, if you have a model of a little grid world, sometimes the model, with you roll it long enough, will tell you that the agent can walk through walls. We don't want that in this setup. So given those constraints, we didn't think, and we tried it, of course, that a neural network model would be a very good choice here. And so instead, we build a k-nearest neighbors model. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this works. So basically, the main idea is just written on the side there. You essentially chain together the observations in the data. And, you know, the operator tried different things in different configurations. And as long as an operator took an action in a particular situation, the agent can take that action too, but it can take it with different frequencies and under different policies than the operator did. And we just stitch all those transitions together to allow that. So how could this work? You imagine that the calibration model is in some state S. We then ask our policy what action it wants to do. And then we look at the data set and we say, okay, find all the nearest neighbors of the data point that is this state and action together. And so we look in the data and we see, okay, there's all kinds of places where we saw this state and action together transitioning to a next state and reward. And then we transition to the one with probability according to some distance function that is the similarity between our input state and action and this SI AI. So we're looking at these nearby states that are similar to our starting state, and we're transitioning probabilistically based on this distance function. So this distance function is interesting and a challenge, and it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But then once we find a sample in the data set that's close by, we'll take that tuple, and then we'll say we'll transition to S prime R. And then we just do that over and over and over. So we just walk through the data in different ways using this distance function to tell us what the state transition is in the data set. And so this is really nice because you can roll this out really, really far, and it'll never get into an invalid state because it's only ever transitioning to things that actually happened. And so it only produces real states and real rewards, and it's very, very, very stable. Of course, the issue here is that there's very limited generalization because we're limited to things that actually happen. And in fact, the only generalization that's happening is through this distance function. This distance function allows us to, you know, say that SA is close to S1, A1, even though they don't exactly match. And so that's the basic setup. And so we kind of did what I always do in my research program, which is we have an idea. We try it out in little small experiments, ones where we can do very, very good empirical practices and get valid conclusions. And if that works, then we try to test it or demonstrate it on something more challenging, where we can't make these careful statistical statements. So we looked at Acrobat, Puddle World, and Cartpole, and we found the approach was much, much more effective than like doing offline RL, where you take a data set and then try to learn the optimal policy and then deploy that optimal policy. Here, we're not deploying the value function or the policy learned from the calibration model. We're just using it to select the best hyperparameters. And then we start learning again from scratch with those hyperparameters in deployment. We also tested a calibration model based on neural networks, and it was much, much worse than the calibration model. It produced invalid states. It wasn't stable under rollouts, exactly what we'd expect. And we tried it with very small data sets, different data gathering policies. The approach seemed fairly robust. And we even tried it in a situation where we changed the dynamics of Acrobat. We actually changed the mass of one of the links in Acrobat between the data collection part and the deployment phase, and it was still robust. I could still find good hyperparameters, even though the world had changed. So we wrote a paper with this. It's called No More Pesky Hyperparameters. It's published in TMLR. So we convinced ourselves with that small empirical study that this looks pretty promising. It looks pretty robust. And so then we started looking at it on the real water treatment plant. And so I just wanted to show you this is what the data from a water treatment plant in Drayton Valley looks like. This is a whole year's worth of data. We're looking at membrane pressure, which is the pressure on those filter pores. So, you know, if the pressure is very high, it means the filter is really clogged up. Turbidity, which is a key number, basically telling you like how many solids are suspended in the water, so how cloudy the water is, and, you know, the temperature of the water coming in. And this plot is over the year, so you can see like winter, spring, summer, fall. You can see interesting things like in early summer, we have the water in the mountains melting and filling up the river and causing the river to flow much more quickly and have all kinds of turbulence in it. That's called the freshet. It happens multiple times during the spring and summer, and we can see it very clearly in the turbidity of the water. The turbidity goes way, way up compared to almost all the rest of the year. We can also see, very normal things like the temperature of the water actually goes up. Like Canada isn't a frozen wasteland. Things actually get warm and then they get cold again. So you see the year-long structure in the data. You also see very individual variations. So the membrane pressure was hardly at all changing during the spring and summer, but changes a bit in the winter. And of course, you can see gaps in this data where the sensors stop recording, and you can see things like spikes in temperature in the winter, but that's because they were actually cleaning the system. So they were spraying with high pressure hot water. So this is what the real data from a real water treatment plant looks like. And so we wanted to build a calibration model from our water treatment plant. So we took a log of data from the operators controlling the plant. We only took 1 week of data, so 350,000 samples, 480 sensor readings. This plant is covered in sensors. But this approach, we also tried it with 1 year of data, and it works perfectly fine. We built the calibration model from the data, and then we treated it like the real world to search for hyperparameter combinations and then find the best one. And the deployment goal for this simple experiment was, can we set the step size of atom using the calibration model such that it'll work well when we run it on the real plant? And so I wanted to show you what the data looks like. So this is a time series of the membrane pressure. And then if we look at the calibration model, which is rolling out for 34 minutes, it's not exactly the same as the membrane pressure, but it has the same shape and the same dynamics and characteristics, which is what's important for selecting hyperparameters. Again, we're not trying to do sim to real transfer here. We're not trying to transfer policies or value functions. We're just trying to find good hyperparameters so that the extent that these time series have similar dynamics but are not identical, that's what we need. And you would just say that this is the time series for the exact same sensor, maybe just at a different time, and that's why they're not the same, because they have the exact same structure, which is really, really nice. And so when we deployed this, we were able to find a step size that allowed the Atom Optimizer and our TD-based agent to make really good long-term predictions of the real water treatment plant running on the system itself. And so we totally achieved our goal of using a crude simulator from the data to pick a good step size, which allows learning on the plant, because we couldn't try out multiple step sizes on the plant. That wasn't an option for us. It's not allowed in this deployment. And so I've left about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So I just kind of want to wrap up because these two topics fit together. So can we do better than the calibration model in real world RL? Absolutely. This was a very straightforward idea, but we need to stop for people to help me make better ideas in the calibration model. They have to stop assuming that everything is a simulator and that tuning doesn't cost us anything, because it does cost us things, and we're interested in problems that aren't simulators. And because they assume those things, people make algorithms that have tons and tons of hyperparameters. We see the trend. The trend is almost exponential in the number of hyperparameters, and that's because people think there are no costs to that. And so we have ideas. There's meta-learning algorithms that can tune the hyperparameters as the agent learns, so we can get rid of hyperparameters. There's just almost no motivation because of the current statistical practices hide the problems that are actually there. And so, to move forward as a community to get better algorithms, that we can then use in the real world, we need better empirical practices and better test problems, right? Like Atari, Majoko, Mountain Car, these are not enough. We need to build test problems that actually replicate real world phenomenon and then treat them like the real world so that we can make progress on these things. So with there, I'll leave us 10 minutes of questions. This is the people who work on RL at the University of Alberta. I actually wasn't there that day, so this is a subset of everyone that works in RL there, but you can see, Marlos is here, Dale, Chaba, Rich is in the front. So really, really big group, lots of students, lots of people caring about this, and several people from your university. So maybe some of you will be in this picture in the future, and that would be wonderful. So thanks, and we can do 10 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your wonderful talk. So let's see if people raise their hands.
hear me?
Yep.
I have a question regarding the distance metric that you said you have in that
Yep.
algorithm. I want to know, is that metric learned, or is there any other way that we can define such metric in our mm, our problems?
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
have
I mean,
a similar problem. Yeah, sorry.
uh, yeah, like this, the naive thing to do would be to do Euclidean distance. But of course, if there's any kind of nonlinearities or you have a high dimensional space, Euclidean is not very useful. Um, we, in this work, we use distances based on the successor representation. So the successor representation is basically a latent encoding of your state space that accounts for how close features are in the transition dynamics of the underlying MDP. So therefore, those vectors that are close by because you can transition between those two latents in the actual MDP. And so we use the successor representation that worked okay. The successor representation is very, very hard to learn. Um, More generally, what is this distance function? If you have a good algorithm for learning a latent representation, if you have a latent representation, then basically that should tell you that you can just take the Euclidean distance between a good latent representation because that's actually encoding things are close by in the underlying state space. But this is an interesting research question about how to get a good distance function. Um, it definitely mattered that we used the successor one. When we used Euclidean, it didn't work very well. So future work to develop this part more for sure.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question which is kind of related to your talk, but it wasn't directly mentioned. Is there any software engineering side that we have to consider? Because the code that I see the latest trend in RL is that people are trying to use JAX for their implementation. One of the reason is because VMAP and PMAP function of JAX that can parallelize the environment and make rollout much faster. But
Yep.
another reason that I have seen in some forum is that it is functional. It is not object oriented, and having functional approach lets people to have more reproducible experiments. Is it true? And what is your recommendation in software engineering side?
Yeah, it's funny that these things go full circle because the original most popular programming language of AI was Lisp, and Lisp, of course, is a functional programming language, and it's the programming language that Rich Sutton programs into this day, which is kind of astounding because I think Lisp is very difficult to use. These things are fads, and so things are popular for 5 to 10 year cycles, and then they disappear. Like I remember when I first joined DeepMind, everything was TensorFlow. And my reaction to that was TensorFlow is awful. It's a horrible way to program. And my reaction was like, you know what? I don't think people are going to be using TensorFlow in a couple of years. And that was true. TensorFlow is now firmly in the garbage because it's so awful. So JAX is going to be popular because of functional things and because of the increased speed, especially when you can run your experiments where both the agent and the environment are on the GPU and you're not sending data off the GPU. That's the very expensive part. All these things will possibly make our code more reproducible. They'll make our experiments faster, but they don't really do anything in terms of like the fundamental problems of reproducibility and doing good statistical practices, because that's always up to the researcher, right? I spent a large part of my academic career developing RL Glue, which was a standardized approach for running reinforced learning experiments. I made the reinforced learning library, and people ignored it because everyone wants to do things exactly the way they want to do it. And so I don't think it really matters what tool you use. I don't think I don't think any one tool is going to make progress on things like reproducibility or any kind of statistical soundness of experiments. You should just pick programming tools that make you work more effectively. It's really a personal choice, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Uh, Hello, Professor. First of all, thanks for the great talk. And I had a question regarding like this calibration model that you develop? Because like I have a RL course now in the university, and our professor says like it's always hard to like build RL in real application, and one of the most important problem is that it's hard to design a reward a function regarding in the application. I wanted to
Okay.
know your view that how did you design the reward model for this specific application, and how was it?
Yeah, reward functions are tricky, and of course, when you go in the real world, you have to design them. I kind of have, yeah, it's weird. It's weird because, in some sense, the water treatment plant, the reward function is trivial. The reward function in the water treatment plant is cost savings or money. If you could figure out how much money you were saving, that's the reward function. It's very, very, very clear. That's all they care about. How do you compute money? Well, that's, how much time you're saving the operators, how much chemical you're using, how much electricity you're using, how much reserve water are you making for the town. If you can convert all of that into money, it's like the easiest reward signal possible. But computing those individual things is actually very, very difficult. So, if you think about chemical dosing, what you end up doing is actually talking to the operators and asking them what they do. Because whenever you do a real world deployment in one of these kind of things, the first thing you want to do is build something that does something like what the operators do and then make it better than what the operators do. And so in chemical dosing, the operators basically have this sensor that shines light through the water column and reports back how much reflectance there is. There's going to be more reflectance if there's more stuff in the water column. And basically what they do is they adjust the chemical dosing when that sensor reports under 96. And so the goal of the system is you get positive reward for keeping that sensor high, and you also get positive reward for reducing chemical usage. So there are lots of deployments where coming up with a reward function is hard, but there are also lots of ones where they're not hard. And I think all of industrial controls, so water treatment, wastewater treatment, water desalination, food and beverage, oil and gas, all these cases, I actually think the reward function is easy. You just talk to the operators and ask them what they're doing.
Okay, so basically what you meant is that you basically try to, like, the main goal is the money, so then you have to split the money into the variables that can affect the money and try to define that in the model, right?
That's what I would like to do, but that's almost never possible. That's the correct answer, but it's an answer that you can't work on, because if I go to a water treatment plant, they have KPIs, they have goals that are set by the organization. We must keep this level above this level. We have to do that. Like, it's a regulatory thing. And so when you have regulatory constraints, like the wastewater plant in Edmonton has an amount of E. coli that can go into the river. That's a regulatory constraint. So that has to be in my reward function.
Okay. Thank you. And I also had another more general question regarding RL. I wanted to know your opinion about about the whole RL. Like, is RL like the most intelligent way of artificial intelligence? Because we have like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and we see that how RL is like changing the scenario of LLM, and how like they are putting on top of these things and making the model kindly be more intelligent. And it wasn't the case like 10 years ago, when you have your course on Coursera, because I also watched that and it was super cool. But like we've seen this change of RL, and RL is being more applied in the industry, in application. I wanted to know that, is it like the most intelligent way, or like what's happened before RL?
So to me, reinforcement learning is just this. It's just an agent interacting with the world, trying to make decisions based on feedback from the world. Temporal difference learning is not reinforcement learning. Options is not reinforcement learning. Q learning is not reinforcement learning. This is reinforcement learning, because reinforcement learning is a problem statement. And to me, this is the best problem statement we have for reflecting agents trying to achieve goals in the world. An LLM is not like this, because the LLM doesn't take actions. Well, I guess it could take actions by spitting out text, but it has no feedback mechanism. So like training an LLM is like taking a child and tying them to a chair and showing them textbooks of information for 20 years and then asking them to go out in the world. It's not a model of interaction with the world. And we know from studies in psychology that learning without action doesn't lead to learning at all. So I think the future of AI research, I think the future of applications is using the reinforced learning formalism. Will it be Q learning? Will it be DQN? Will it be PPO? Probably not, but it'll be this problem formulation. That's my bet.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you, Professor. I think our time is up, but we have another student that his hands is up. Do you?
Let's do it.
Yes.
Hello, sir, Dr. White. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I really enjoyed your talk, especially the part that you said the hyperparameters should be tuned for each problem. And I've seen many articles around uh, with some new algorithms they came up, but they haven't really tuned their hyperparameters. I wonder if there's any special repositories for finding these tuned hyperparameters that we can use for our research in a special workbench.
Yeah, so my message is don't tune hyperparameters. That's a lot of compute and it's misleading anyway.
Sure.
If you want to compare to another algorithm, use the same environment that they use so that you know that the designer of that algorithm did an okay job of tuning their hyperparameters. But we want to get away from hyperparameter tuning because we can't do it in the real world anyway. Yeah, so avoid hyperparameter tuning at all costs.
Okay, but is there any repository that has all these tuned hyperparameters available that we can use them besides what the main article has suggested, besides in other workbenches?
I'd always try to go to the main article and the code that came up with it,
Okay.
because other people implement things in different ways, and we know implementation choices matter a lot. And so if you use someone else's implementation of an algorithm, that's maybe not actually DQN, you're using something else. And so there are repositories like spinning up baselines, but that was made by the creators of all those algorithms, so I trust it a little bit more. But I would be very, very cautious using code off the internet, because there's just, I can go very early on when AI Gym came out, I pointed out bugs in the way they implemented this reinforcement learning loop, and they just didn't understand and they never fixed it. So bugs are very, very common, and those bugs matter, and implementation choices matter. And so, yeah, if you're using someone else's code, you might have to spend just as much time convincing yourself that the code is correct by like reproducing the results of the original paper.
Okay, thank you. And other question I have is about the model you have built and calibrated here. You have, as I have understood, you have collected logs of data and how an action causes the transition from a state to another. But in reality, because I come from the control group, I believe that there are some differential equations that govern some systems. So is it a right practice? Is it a good practice to like approximate some states with another? Will that just ruin the differential equation that governs the system?
So remember, the differential equations are also models. The universe doesn't actually follow a differential equation, right? That's just our understanding of how the world works. There are lots of people that try to model things like water treatment plants with differential equations. The issue with that approach is that they'll come up with a model, and it likes to even pretend that it's accurate when they build it. This water treatment plant is very non-stationary. It's dependent on what the operators do. It's dependent on the water conditions. It's dependent on how much the pipes have calcified. It depends on how the pumps are operating. Very quickly, the plant drifts away from the model, and that model becomes useless. I even went into a water treatment plant where they, on their little HMI display, they had a little number, and they said that number was a model that we got built 5 years ago of our water treatment plant, and we don't pay attention anymore because it's so inaccurate. The problem with real systems is they change over time. So at least when you're looking at the data from the plant, that data is reflecting, where it is now, one sec. That data is reflecting the non-stationarity of the system. And so modeling sometimes happens, and in fact, we've talked with many, many plants and they just say, yeah, we can't afford to pay someone to build a model. There's no resources for that.
Well, thank you for your answers. I really appreciate it. And I enjoyed your talk. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Do we have time for another student?
Yeah, of course.
Hello, Professor. I had a question. When we experience an explosion during training the network, how should we set the best parameters to solve this problem?
So you're saying you're training your network and then things are going bad and you want to change the hyperparameter so it works well?
Yeah, exactly. For exploiting gradient problem.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that because I don't spend a lot of time running experiments myself anymore. But basically what people do is they try to instrument their agent by monitoring all kinds of different variables and then trying to see the source of the explosion, right? Like, in the old days when I was a student and Rich was my professor, he'd say, print out all the stuff inside your agent and then step through the printout until you find the thing that's going wrong, and then you'll identify what's going wrong. And so agents are bigger now, they're more complicated, but packages like weights and biases can allow you to monitor all the variables inside your agent. And then you just look and see when things are going wrong and then try to use that as a way to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your time and for your wonderful talk. Just for the closing question, I just want to ask you, what's your general advice for the people that are starting their research career in the RL in 2025?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like I said, I personally believe that the reinforced learning formalism, we haven't hit the peak of RL because people have avoided doing it for so long, and that RL's impact on the world and on the research community is yet to come. And so my advice to students generally is almost topic independent, which is the whole goal in research is to ask questions and understand things. And so there's a lot of failure and criticism in research. You try 10 things, 9 of them, the world just says, there's no signal here. And then one of them, you get a little bit of an idea of what the next question to ask is. That's what research is. It's lots of trying things, lots of failing, and then asking more and more questions. And so my general advice to researchers is that fall in love with asking the questions. Research is not these big breakthroughs and state-of-the-art results that people think it is. It's just about understanding things a little bit more over time and getting those little small successes. If you can do that and you can remain productive, you'll be a successful researcher. You have to be very lucky, of course. I've been astonishingly lucky in my life. Any researcher that you would invite to give a lecture in this class has been insanely lucky. And if they don't tell it to you, they probably just forgot that. And so just work hard, try to understand things, and try to be in love with the enterprise of research, because it's not about, I like what Mark Schmidt from UBC said, which is a lot of people think that if you write 20 papers a year, that will matter. And he says his goal is to write one good paper a year, because you're going to be known in your career for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 papers. You're not going to be known for your 40 or 100 papers. So try to figure out what those good papers are going to be. What are those nice little small insights that you can communicate well?
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I think it was a great advice to close the session with. Thank you again for accepting our invite. It was truly an honor to have you with us, and I think we're very grateful for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, and I think have a good rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.